Evening, everyone. So normally we save the applause until the end, and don't put your applause yet. But I have to say, Khalid, you've done such a fantastic job at convening this. I know it's not just you. There's a big team behind you. And I do remember the time when we first met. And when I was looking about how many years back that was, it was only 2.5 years back. And I'm thinking about how much you've done in 2.5 years, how much you and your team has done to convene such an impressive event. I do have one question though. Do you sleep at all? But seriously, before we get started on tonight's panel, and I know my panelists will have a lot of exciting comments and insights to share, I do want everyone to give a round of applause to World Anti-Extremism Network, and especially Mr. Khalid Ramsey. So to the panel, and there's not much housekeeping in addition to what's already been said, but two things that I've been warned by the organizers to mention is number one, you have to eat. So please do pay attention to us. Do dutifully use Slido. I have to admit, as a moderator, I'm still madly trying to understand what this app is and ensure that I get the questions in, but please do submit your questions by Slido. So let's get started. And as I said, there's a couple framing things that I want to mention before getting to each panelist. I think we had a great keynote speech by Brad Lips earlier. So I don't want to repeat some of the themes that he's mentioned, but I think there's three guiding themes that are important for all of the work that you're doing. The first one is, and I think this was indicated quite clearly in some of the speeches we've heard already, is that the world is facing pressure on a number of different fronts. So from Venezuela to North Korea to Belarus, and of course to our friends in Ukraine who are frontline defenders of freedom. So the first theme, I think, is resilience under that pressure, whether it's overseas or whether it's here in Canada. The second one, I think this is the exciting thing why I'm interested, and I'm sure this room is interested to hear about all the work you're doing, is that we all have individual agency and we all have individual responsibility. So thinking about some of the work that all of you are doing as champions for freedom in your different lines of work. And the second one, the final one, is what are the lessons that we can learn? And ideally, we wake up some days and we feel we're in a very dark world. Sometimes we feel see the darkness in our own country. Where's the hope? So where is the silver lining in a lot of this darkness? So with that said, I want to turn to you first, Patrick. And before kind of getting into, I know you're an expert in the Middle East, you can tell us all about what's happening right now in some of the ways, economically in particular, because I know you focus on the economic side, how we can be seeing some of those silver linings. But I want to talk about your personal journey a little bit, how you sort of got into this, and what your own personal lessons are for those in the room. So I'll start with you, Patrick.
Well, first I would like to say a big thank you for the World Anti-Extremism Network for the great gathering they are doing here. And it's a real honor to be with you and to share the conversation today. So I come from Lebanon. That's a long way to Toronto. A country divided by sectarian tensions, weak institutions, armed group, and in the region that turmoil is the daily news basically. And I personally believe that economic freedom can be a common denominator around which we can build stronger institutions, long-lasting peace, and prosperity for the whole region. And so basically my journey is based on this principle. I do think that if we can promote economic freedom, the free movement of people, of capital, of goods in the region, make it easy for people to own things, have a stake, in prosperity. Tensions can be reduced, peace can thrive, and extremism can be curbed. That's where I come from.
Okay, thanks so much, Andrea.
Well, I guess I started out as a human rights activist here in Toronto and in part here at U of T. I was a teenage anti-racist activist involved in the mid-90s. There was a spate of neo-Nazism in Toronto, streets of Toronto, and volunteered organizing, speaking at rallies and so on as a teenager, and then came to U of T. And I remember being here at Hart House when there was a big walkout when George Bush Sr. Was receiving an honorary degree here. People were protesting the Iraq War. So some of who I am as a human rights activist was shaped in my early years here. And being here in Hart House, I was reflecting on how much time we have before us. Of course, a lot of time has passed behind us when we think about history, but I said to my father, I'm going to Hart, events at Hart House. I used to have lunch there every day. I used to use the gym. And he said, when I used to go to Hart House, they didn't allow women. And I thought, wow, I mean, that's in his lifetime. Just that change in this very building, to think how much has changed. But for me, the real seminal moment was 9/11. I was in law school in Georgetown in DC on 9/11, and the world that I knew that I thought I was going to practice law in changed fundamentally. And I was studying international human rights law in January 2002 when the first detainees arrived in Guantanamo. My professor showed us pictures of men in orange jumpsuits, hooded, ears covered, and I went on to represent a lot of those men as a lawyer, both people who would never be charged as well as some who were in the military commission system. So sort of watching the world change around me, but being raised in an environment of activism, of believing that I had a responsibility to stand up for what was right is, I guess, the through line for my career. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you, Andrea, and welcome home, not just at Hart House, but to Canada as well. Joanna, please tell us a little bit about your story.
So I am also born and raised in Toronto, still live down the street in Toronto. Really happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invite, Khalid. When I spoke to Khalid about this panel, he said to me, I'm really stressed out today because my family has had all of Afghanistan has had the internet cut off, so I can't get in touch with anyone. And I was like, wow, like those are like, that's real stuff. I grew up in a family of Holocaust survivors. My grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and somehow if I got one idea from my upbringing, it was that sphere of protection of individuals from the state was just non-negotiable. I started out my career after law school as a criminal defense lawyer, working for the great Eddie Greenspan, and he really understood that there have to be certain sort of sacred spheres of protection that no matter what, the state cannot cross. I was the last associate hired by him. Unfortunately, he died of heart failure about 2 months after I started work for him. So I had to face a sort of identity crisis early on in my career. Around that time, I met the executive director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation and came on. And in January, it will be 10 years since I started working for the CCF. So it must have been a good fit. So I started off with our educational group, which is now a standalone organization called the Running Need Society. And then in 2019, I was asked to take over as executive director. And I thought that my sort of imprimatur on the organization would be to do more criminal defense, presumption of innocence, fundamental freedoms cases. But then less than a year into taking the job, of course, the pandemic hit, which completely, nobody was a black swan event, I suppose. And when things happened in Canada that I guess I'll talk to you about this evening, that nobody could have foreseen, the government intervening into areas of life that none of us ever would have imagined. And Canada had a track record that I would say is not very distinguished throughout the pandemic. So we were proud to sort of explode our capacity during that period. And we're still dealing with some of the consequences and probably will be for some time to come.
Well, thank you, Joanna. I'm not picking on you because you're the last one to go, but building on some of those points, actually, I'd like to start with the one lawyer on the panel. I think there's one lawyer on the panel. She's two lawyers on the panel. Okay, great. Please be brief. So I'm going to start with you, Joanna, and we're going to go a little bit macro after that. We're going to talk about the global picture. We're going to talk about things in the Middle East in particular with Patrick. But actually, sticking here at home in Canada, you've done such great work. Your organization has done such great work. I wonder if you can dive into, at a general level, some of the worries that you see about the freedom of expression here in Canada. the sort of constraints right now on civil liberties, and ideally what some of the great things that your organization is doing, but what some in this room can also do. So how can we be helping some of the great work that your organization is doing? What are you seeing? What are the worries that kind of keep you up at night? And how can we all help?
Yeah, so I would say over the past 5 years, it's undeniable that a sort of soft authoritarianism is present and normalized in Canada. Obviously, we had this Canadian default to what my colleague Christine, who's here, calls safetyism, where there was just like this Canadian obsessiveness of let's err on the side of the most caution. And it really became, and so we saw, you know, many absurdities. Christine and I wrote a whole book about this called Pandemic Panic. You know, in Quebec, if you were unvaccinated, you had to take a gurney through Walmart with a plastic cover so that you wouldn't interact with the vaccinated people. Just like a million examples like this. But where it's not funny and it became very serious was on February 14th, 2022, when then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act for the first time in history in response to the Freedom Convoy. And famously, even our international guests will remember, indeed, froze individuals' bank accounts without warrants, guaranteed the banks could be indemnified against any repercussions of that, restricted the right to peaceful protest throughout the country so that cops could shut down protests on, you know, the flimsiest of pretenses. And of course, this was only in effect for about 9 days, but the impact was clear, and I think the impact was understood around the world immediately. If a country like Canada, which on many days is similar to, you know, blue states in America, if they could seize assets and freeze bank accounts, preventing individuals in the dead of Canadian winter from accessing their funds on the basis of supporting a cause that the Prime Minister personally disagreed with, you can guarantee that that got the notice of authoritarian governments as well as soft authoritarians alike. Now, currently we have a Prime Minister, as you know, Mark Carney, who made it clear during the time of this crisis that he viewed the Freedom Convoy protesters as seditious. He used that word in our national newspaper, the Globe and Mail. He fully endorsed all kinds of financial penalties, including freezing of bank accounts. During his campaign, he talked about how he saw social media as pollution and just a sea of misinformation, bigotry, Islamophobia, and he backed that up by bringing in Bill C-9, which is his speech bill, which criminalizes mere symbols, which lowers the threshold for hate speech, which basically is giving a yellow flag to law enforcement to charge and pursue individuals for all manner of speech infringements. And of course, the government has tried its hand at regulating online discourse with the Online Harms Act, which is dormant for now, but could come back at any time. More broadly, though, I would say the pandemic has had really lasting repercussions in Canada, both because there was such widespread acceptance of blatantly unconstitutional measures, quarantine hotels, vaccine passports, including ones with no medical exemptions. And I'm proud to say that those two cases are ones that the Canadian Constitution Foundation unsuccessfully challenged, but challenged and fought like hell. Nonetheless, the courts, with the very notable exception of the Emergencies Act, which we challenged and which was successfully declared unconstitutional. And hopefully that will be upheld on appeal. We're still waiting to hear. We've been waiting almost a year now, but we'll fight it all the way with the Supreme Court. But there was such widespread judicial deference on these things. And the last thing I'll say is that once you sort of introduce these types of measures like curfews, vaccine passports, these very disproportionate measures as public policy ideas, and you see that a majority of the population accepts them, which a majority of Canadians did, and polling still indicates that a majority of Canadians accept the invocation of the Emergencies Act, it really gives governments permission to go again. And we saw this summer when, I'm very, very self-serving, but I mean, when the CCF sees something this wrongful, it's our job to do something about it. there was a threat of forest fires in very certain parts of the maritime province of Nova Scotia. And in response, Premier Tim Houston issued a blanket forest lockdown. No hiking, no recreational activities in the whole province, more or less. So essentially, COVID-era policy repurposed in this very disproportionate, irrational way. And to me, that just suggests that muscle reflex is very much in the Canadian DNA, and we can only imagine, the scenarios where it may come to play again. So that keeps me up at night.
Okay, fantastic. And I do want others to feel free to jump in and comment on this, but I want to move to you next, Andrea, and sort of take some of the lessons that Joanna just mentioned, which were really insightful, and take it more to the global level. I know that you're following challenges, backsliding, and many across the world, especially many liberal democracies as well. You're seeing this. Joanna, I think, very artfully discussed what's happening in Canada. What are some of the concerns that you're seeing globally? So you're based in Washington. I won't ask you to answer the question in Washington, but I'll ask you globally. What are some of the challenges that you're finding? I know that you're focused on a number of parts of the world, but in particular the Middle East, which Patrick's going to talk about too. Can you tell me about a few of the hotspots that you're focused on, and potentially it would be interesting, the ones that maybe we're not paying attention to? So what are a few of the areas that maybe the global audience has their mind fixated on, a couple of geographies, but maybe isn't focused on, that you could share with us?
So at Freedom Now, we represent political prisoners of conscience, people who are detained because they are journalists, bloggers, political opponents, family members of the above, basically anyone that usually authoritarians don't like, but there are prisoners of conscience in democracies as well. So, and of course, as we know, around the world, there are countries that I would place somewhere along a spectrum between a democracy and an autocracy. And sadly, the work is essentially unlimited. There are tens of thousands of prisoners of conscience around the world. At Freedom Now, in particular, we do a great deal of work in Eurasia and Central Asia. So I would say those are countries where we go to meetings. I will skip the US when I talk about it. I appreciate that. But we go to meetings in Congress or in the EU and, talk about Kazakhstan, talk about Azerbaijan. There are better known countries. We had a client who was just released from Belarus, for example. In part, of course, I think his case was well known because of our efforts, but he was also part of a larger agreement made at much higher political levels than I can routinely access. So I would really say we do cover the globe. If you take a look at our website, we have a map where you can see, we represent people all over the world, in Cuba, not as many cases in Africa or in the Middle East right now, but not because there's a lack of need. There are upwards of 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt alone, for example, a country I used to work on a great deal. So for us, when we look at cases, it's really about where we think we can have an impact. I was chatting with some people earlier. We don't have many cases in China or Russia, not because there aren't political prisoners. Of course, there are thousands. But the levers that we have available to us don't work the same way. It doesn't really matter if I get an opinion from the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention that someone being detained by Russia is arbitrarily detained. The political efforts that we can engage in, the public advocacy, don't have a real impact right now. That doesn't mean we give up. It's often in those areas, including Afghanistan, where we have a program supporting Afghan women, that we really turn to grassroots and to civil society and think about how can we, with access to some of the levers of power, support people who are making their own decisions about what they want to see in their governments. And one of the things we find with political prisoners in particular is that a political prisoner is not one person. The prisoner, him or herself, is one person, of course, detained, but the ripple effects that political detention has go to the person's family, to sometimes it's their, whether it's an ethnic group or religious group, or if it's a trade union. And of course, we also see transnational repression, authoritarian countries reaching across borders to try to achieve their political goals, usually by terrifying family members, other loved ones of political prisoners. And that's an issue that democracies, Western democracies in particular, need to pay a great deal of attention to, and have not done as much as they should. Of course, I know there are prominent cases in Canada, very prominent ones, but forms of transnational repression are occurring at a much less public and lower level at all times in Canada and the US and the UK. And that is a component of the reach of authoritarians. They detain people at home, they terrify their families, and then they reach across borders to really terrify others. That is among the reasons why this is a global issue with only global solutions. But I believe global solutions start at home. They start with the people who are most directly affected by human rights abuses. And then what I can do, my organization can do, is support them in their individual efforts.
Well, thanks so much. I think it's thanks for bringing this back to Canada as well. Because I think often, as many of us in the room know too, authoritarian actors don't use the same toolkits that we do. So we like to tidily compartmentalize our tools and say, well, we have our economic tools here, we have our legal tools here, we have our national security tools here. Authoritarian actors use all the tools available to them, transnational repression, arbitrary detention, etc. And we've seen that very clearly in Canada. I do want to ask you a very quick follow-up too on how you see certain actors. This forum ideally for them today and then tomorrow is talking about sharing best practices. So freedom advocates, how can we work together? Are you seeing worst practices being shared by these actors? I mean, this is something that keeps me up at night. Of course, Russia and China being the largest convergence, but you see it more broadly with a lot of authoritarian actors talking more, sharing ideas, sharing surveillance technologies. Is this something you see at all in your work, and does this worry you?
It's a huge problem. I don't know if Patrick will touch on this in the Middle East, but one of the things we see in the Middle East is countries detaining someone who may be transiting, totally unrelated, maybe passing through Dubai or Qatar, and being detained at the request of another government, and then being sent to a government where they will be detained arbitrarily. That's a sort of tiny sliver of the problem. The intelligence sharing is quite significant. But even when it comes to a country's own citizens, governments are not always willing to stand up and demand their freedom.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. This is a great segue to you, Patrick. Sorry, you've been very patient. But I'd love to, so Patrick, you spend your time in Lebanon, but also here in Montreal. So we're happy that you've chosen us as at least half of your domicile. But I'd like you to dive a little bit deeper into the Middle East. So many in this room know what's happening right now, some of the challenges close to your region. But what are some of the stories that we're not following? And also, if you can give us a little bit on the rays of hope too. Maybe I'm being a little bit too optimistic here. But some of the things that you're seeing here, some of the challenges that maybe in this room we're not paying attention to, but also in this opportunity set. What are some of the things that you've been seeing, whether it's based there in Lebanon, that would be helpful in this room? Patrick, please.
Sure. So, of course, the Middle East has been changing rapidly. Prior to October 7, I would say, there has been a tendency for the Arab nations, the GCC specifically, the Gulf countries, they were trying to have more peaceful relations with Israel, eventually culminating in some countries signing the Abraham Accords, and everyone was waiting for the KSA, the Saudi Arabia, to engage in those accords. And then, there was a peace tendency happening before October 7, but there was also an axis who was opposed to that peace. And here I'm thinking about Iran, Syria with the Assad regime, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza. And then October 7 happened. And one of the consequences of October 7 has been the weakening of Iran massively. The Assad regime in Syria fell, which basically cut ties for Hezbollah. All the weapons used to transit through Syria to come and out, those militias have been terminated because the new regime in Syria is not very sympathetic with Iran. Hamas has been weakened, of course. And Hezbollah has been weakened. The whole leadership of Hezbollah has been distinct. It has not been terminated, but weakened substantially. Now, with what is happening now, we see a kind of return toward an attempt to move toward peace. IPF said today in DC, and I think peace is on the agenda, conditions and the details. Before October 7, it was very complicated to bring Lebanon and Syria into those instruments. Now, the story is different. And I do see a role for Saudi Arabia to hold those countries in their hands, try to bring them more toward peace. In Lebanon specifically, even before October 7, there has been a majority, a parliamentary majority for elections that was anti-Hezbollah, actually. But this majority was unable to form a government or to elect a president because the Hezbollah broke the whole democratic process. The weakening of Hezbollah in Lebanon allowed this majority to elect a new president, to appoint a new government. And the priority of the president and the government is the disarmament of Hezbollah. So basically things are moving. Now in parallel to this political dimension, there is a need for, well, let's put it this way, economic priorities are reemerging. We are thinking about the reconstruction of Gaza, reconstruction of Lebanon, of Syria. Right? So there are a lot of economic interests. And the question here is, how will the reconstruction happen? Are we going to give money in a way that will end up in the hand of the wrong people? Or is there a way to reconstruct those areas in the same way that would be focused more on prosperity, on the pursuit of happiness, rather than the pursuit of war? And that's, I think, where we as the Lebanese Institute for Market Studies have been engaged. Basically trying to say that when money should not go to the government, most of the sectors that are currently monopolized by the government, whether in Lebanon or in Syria, the monopoly should be dismantled. Private companies should be able to produce electricity, offer telecommunication services, run airports, ports. We don't need the government to do that. Private companies can do that. Let competition happen. Those who are more competitive will sell their product and let the population decide. By shrinking the size of the government, we will be shrinking the corruption within the government. If you cut the government into half, in Lebanon and Syria, you'll be cutting corruption into half. So reducing the possibility of this money to go to the wrong direction. And for the sectors where it's hard to have competition, we call them national monopolies in economics, well, it's good to have a transparent procurement process where we have real competition with leaders. Which company should run the airports, for example? Let's have competitive bids. Let's the best company win, not the company attached to a certain political party or a certain armed group engaged to pay retro payments. We don't want those people. We want the most efficient people. And so there is a lot of work to be done on the economic reform in light of potential reconstruction in the country. I do think that's a very important priority, and that's where we are.
Thanks. And when you're talking about Syria, it's interesting. I mean, I think we can all agree about some of the bad actors that were happy or not there anymore. I think two things were needed. One of them is the reemergence of old actors, and I think you see this with Russia's case, for example. There was a lot of excitement that Russia maybe dislodged in Syria, and all of a sudden you're seeing Russia potentially either re-emerging or reinstating its emergence. And I think you also have to worry about some of those newer actors too. So I think that's also interesting, especially if we're talking about anti-extremism and some of the other new actors that we're concerned about as well. Well, we've been having this discussion. I feel like my leg is like on a constant vibration. I'm not looking at my phone because I'm not interested, but I'm seeing a Slido, which I'm slowly figuring out with lots of different messages. And some of them actually very much on point with the discussion here. So I'm actually going to give some agency back to this room and send some of these questions to the panel. And Joanna, I'm going to start with you. So we have a question here, which I think is really interesting and right up your alley, that's saying, do you think the recent uses of the notwithstanding clause will have a negative effect on Canadian democracy? So I'm sure you have a very opinionated view on this. And if you can give it to us in 3 or 4 minutes, that would be or less.
Do I think that the use of the notwithstanding clause will have a negative effect on Canadian democracy? No, I actually think it will have the opposite effect, and I'm not substantively endorsing Danielle Smith's policy on pronouns or breaking down the teacher strike or whatever. But I think in Canada, uniquely, we have the notwithstanding clause because we don't want a pure juristocracy. We think that there are some things in society, and this has been, maybe it's just in my circles that I'm like rolling my own eyes to say this, but it was part of our original constitutional compromise. Once we had an entrenched Bill of Rights in 1982 with the Charter, we didn't want to lose our Westminster supremacy nature of government. We also understood that we're bringing together a geographically vast country with very different economic interests, with very different cultural sensitivities, and so the ability of the legislature to, some would say, put forward their own interpretations of rights and say to us, this is what equality means to us. Protecting parental rights needs to go hand in hand with protecting the equality of LGBTQ or gender diverse youth, and we're not going to trust these. We're going to allow a mechanism for the final say to temporarily put in the hands of the legislature. So I think it's exciting. I think that it's bad for national unity, it's bad for diversity, it's bad for faith and democracy when too much authority is put into, I don't want to call them philosopher kings, Canadian judges, right? They're appointed, they're quite cloistered, they speak their own languages, and you and I are lawyers, so you know to talk to a non-lawyer like we're swindling. There are many aspects of collective life that aren't captured by pure legal analysis. And I think the rough and tumble of hashing it out with these very divisive issues, like preferred pronouns and how to balance respecting the dignity of trans youth, but also respecting legitimate concerns of families and parents. I think that is exactly the type of venue where you want some connection to the lifeblood of individuals who are actually connected to citizens, connected to communities, and it also fosters diversity, right? So if Alberta or Saskatchewan or two jurisdictions that have signaled their intention to invoke the notwithstanding clause in connections with pronoun laws, if they go ahead with this and we see the results in 5 or 10 years, then the rest of the country gets to see that and adapt. We get to have these sort of marketplaces of democracy. So I think there are critiques about legislatures doing things for obviously electoral reasons, and doing things to appeal to lower passions. I think those are fair critiques. But the question was specifically if I'm concerned about democracy, and no, I think this is a very exciting time for Canadian democracy because the notwithstanding clause is back in vogue. It was pretty much moribund even 10 years ago when I started working in this field. It was basically a dead letter, and I think it certainly signals a healthy immune system on the part of Canadian democracy that as judges have become more and more overreaching, and more in a way, just arrogant, I would say, in their ability to adjudicate very divisive disputes, like of course, euthanasia, safe injection sites. These are very complex things, and they can't just be paved over by a serene judicial decision. So I think it's healthy. We're really excited to be intervening in the upcoming series of appeals, English Montreal School Board, which is about what judges have to do once the notwithstanding clause is invoked. They have to put down their pens, or can they weigh in with their own reasons? And I see good arguments on both sides. But no, I think the notwithstanding clause has injected something, a really necessary corrective into Canada as a whole.
Excellent. Okay, so we're going to pivot back to this side of the panel with another related question. I think this is something that we've been talking about since the beginning of the night. I think all the things have kind of reflected on it, but the question is, democratic backsliding is often influenced by regional geopolitics, which I think we've mentioned quite clearly. What regional dynamics should we pay attention to when designing strategies for freedom? So We all know that geopolitics is shifting some of these backsliding incidents in individual countries. But what are some of the strategies that we can ideally put in place to try to rectify or remedy some of these challenges? So, Andrea, I'll start with you, and then Patrick and Steve as well.
Well, I would say, with my work being situated in the context of international human rights law, that I really see the struggle for the recognition of human rights to be a global one. And the more that we can draw those connections and find the similarities across borders, across communities, the stronger the movement for international human rights, for recognizing human rights becomes. And I think we've seen that in recent years. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement, the organization, the movement for Black Lives had Free Palestine prior to October 7th, had Free Palestine as one of its tenets. The idea that oppressed people stand in solidarity with oppressed people everywhere, as one demands the recognition of human rights, you can do that in solidarity with people around the world doing the same thing. And that's something that we do try to do at Freedom Now. We try to draw those connections. That's not to say that individual experiences are not unique, and sometimes our country context is so important. Take, for example, Afghanistan, where it's in a deeply unique country context, and yet, as part of the movement for the recognition of gender apartheid as a crime against humanity, we see Iranian women and Afghan women working together for that recognition. So that's an area where people have found commonalities despite very different experiences. And that's something that we try to promote in all the work that we do, to really look at the issues rather than the specific country or regional context.
Okay, that's great. Patrick, there's some views on that. I'm going to add another difficult task onto you, an additional question on top of that, which I think is related, which is specific to the Middle East. But what is looking at what role can economic freedom and regional cooperation play in building a sustainable peace and prosperity in the Middle East? And you touched on it a little bit in your initial comments, but if you can sort of add on to some of the question that Andrea answered and answer that second one, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. I'll start with the first question related to backsliding. And I do think that the main concern in the Middle East specifically is we do have very high youth unemployment. They don't find any opportunity, basically, to work, to make a living. They don't own anything. And the other side of the spectrum, we have a very corrupt government controlling massive resources. So those young people are in despair. They are hopeless, and which create a very fertile ground for extremism, right? And you have those armed groups rising and capturing this despair. And that's a big problem, and that's an economic problem, I would say. So how can we move to a setting where we can create jobs, we can create opportunity for those young people? And I would say that economic freedom can help us get to this objective. So, because economic freedom first, it gives property to those people. So they will have a stake in stability, right? If you own something, you don't want it to be destroyed. In Lebanon, for example, each time Hezbollah engages in an adventure, people who are into tourism, for example, they are crazy against that. It kills their business. And the majority now is against Hezbollah's adventures anyway, because the instability is very costly. When people are producing, when people are prospering, when everybody is in despair, you have nothing to lose anyway. So that's, I think, a key point. The second point would be we should limit corruption. Government corruption is a very big problem. I touched on those a little bit earlier. We need to reduce the size of government. We need to increase transparency, competition, and reducing corruption would increase public trust in government institutions and reduce the sense of despair, I would say. The third aspect is that we should be able to create jobs by liberating the economy. So, for example, mostly in Lebanon and Syria, we're highly engaged on those issues. We need to break down, for example, the electricity monopoly. So the electricity is very, very expensive. Most of the time we have outages. And if you break down the electricity monopoly, you can create jobs in industries, in agriculture. Agriculture is irrigation. Irrigation is electricity. People don't have electricity, right? You need to break down the telecom monopoly in order to create jobs in technology, because if you don't have internet, how can you have any type of technology, you need to break down the multi-million airline, air transportation, or to have tourism. And if we do that, then we can create jobs, we can create growth, entrepreneurship will rise, and people will have hope to be able to grow on their own rather than relying on their government to provide them with the resources when the government controls all the resources. So taking people away from the government, giving them agency, empowerment to basically be in control of their life, to prosper, I think will lead to more peace because they will have interest in staying in peace. Would you like me to go to the second one? Yeah. And so, in relation to economic cooperation, definitely, when you enable the free movement of people, capital, and goods across the regions, really good things happen. I can give you a lot of examples. In Lebanon, for example, we don't have a cheap source of energy. We've been hungry to get cheap gas from somewhere. Right? We can get from Qatar, we can get from Egypt, maybe from Israel, right? And there are many places. But because of those wars happening and those tensions, because you cannot get the gas into your power plants, so energy integration cooperation is very important. The oil exports, the production of oil in the GCC, the routes that it will take to get to Europe, that's very important. This will play a role in that. The movement of people, migration, war caused a massive migration problem in Syria or in the West. Peace, prosperity would bring people back. In Lebanon, we started to see that, and in Syria, immigrants are starting to their home countries, so good things are happening. Many Syrian expats who fled the war, refugees basically, are happy to return to their country for tourism at least. So there is an opportunity to invest in tourism in Syria, in Lebanon. Capital should be able to flow. There is a lot of opportunities and cross-regional cooperation, but for that, tension needs to be reduced and people can focus more on prosperity, less on war.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Patrick. And it's a huge question, and you answered very well. So we're getting towards the 11th hour here. We have a few minutes left, and I'm conscious that you only have a salad to eat so far. Forgiveness, and you're eating for food. So, Joanna, I'm going to go back to you with another question, and finally to Andrea, and we're going to finish up. So there's lots of questions coming in the slide. I wish that you could talk over water or drinks afterwards. So people with chasers on an outstanding clause. So I won't go there right now, but we can talk to some of those guests later. But I'd like to actually think about this a little bit beyond the horizon for this final question. Is we talked about some of the challenges now. You know, you don't have to be optimistic, but where do you see sort of the trajectory, particularly in Canada, on civil liberties? You talked about some of the unfortunate incidents during the pandemic, some of the things since. I think we talked about Nova Scotia, and I know that quite acutely as a Nova Scotian who went back that summer and basically had to hang out in my parents' basement rather than go out to my favorite park. So, what do you see that trajectory? Do you see it getting worse and worse? I know it's a hard question to answer, but what do you see in the next couple of years, and what do you do to rectify that if it is going in the wrong direction?
So I'll address that. I first want to kind of touch on the geopolitics question because I have a particular Canadian perspective on this, which is I think one of the most interesting things about Canada, and I'm sure it's not unique to Canada, but we're in Canada, is the effect of diaspora politics and our national politics. And I think currently it's very toxic. We have a current government, which many of the people are the same as the previous government, that will just completely kowtow to what they perceive to be, their constituencies' particular interests, and it is completely preventing Canada from forming a morally defensible, in our self-interest, even logically consistent foreign policy. A famous quote of this is Mardini, our former foreign minister, who, when asked to explain some incoherent policy in regards to Israel and Gaza war, said, have you seen the demographics of my writing? And that really epitomizes a lot of Canadian policy. On the flip side, though, the most natural allies for the freedom movement are actually Canadian diaspora communities. It's not a mistake that the two leaders of this fine organization both come from countries where they understand exactly what is at stake and they understand exactly where things are headed, when you have bank accounts frozen, when you have speech locked in. So let's park that. So I think, I came of age in the era when Stephen Harper and Jason Kenney, were able to convince conservatives that Canada's extraordinary diversity could really be harnessed for our strength, and I would like to see that come back into style, because I think currently Canada is being cannibalized by diaspora interests as perceived by these elites in Ottawa who have a completely wrong-headed view, in my opinion. As for the prospects going into the future, we do consistent polling at the Canadian Constitution Foundation about sentiments around freedom and liberty, and we've seen something interesting in the past year or two, which is polarization. That there are more people now who explicitly say they are illiberal. They don't think that freedom and liberty are principles to be supported and defended. We also have a stronger, passionate demographic on the other side. So I think that can be harnessed, and we all understand. We see what's going on in the U.S. on both sides of the political aisle. We understand that this polarization and this illiberalism is growing in our midst. And we just have to be stronger. I particularly think that the shock in Canada, the pandemic era, pretty much every freedom-oriented not-for-profit saw a huge uptick in donations and support, and that's because people woke up, and I still think people are awake. And the huge, we do some polling about social media mentions and stuff like that, and our mentions completely exploded in August with this forced lockdown. People understood right away. You cannot pull the wool over their eyes. People are awake, and so that gives me some hope.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for the optimism as well. That's great. That's a very engaging part here. Andrea, I want to take this for the last question to you on the global level, and we've talked already in this panel with the different vectors of pressure that are happening for a lot of authoritarian actors happening within countries. We've seen it very viscerally in a lot of your cases. We talked about the sort of sharing of worst practices where some of those authoritarian actors work together. What do you see from an optimistic perspective going forward in the next few years? And also, I want to ask you a question, frankly, about the money part of it, because I don't want to put this at the feet of any one country, but many of the champions and some of the champions in this room do need, even if it's basic funding, to continue to subsist. But we're seeing a clawback, it seems, on funding when it comes to a lot of these issues, and a much more realpolitik, interest-only type of approach to geopolitics, which is unfortunately not looking at the human rights and values side of it. So does this part worry you? Are you seeing, when it comes to the funding perspective, many of the civil society groups and actors that have been our champions, have been our allies, suffering under this? And if so, how can we try to rectify that?
So the funding is what keeps me up at night, because I have an organization to run. I'm glad to hear that you saw an uptick in donations. The situation for nonprofits in the US right now is incredibly dire. My organization doesn't take any government funds, so we were not directly affected by the significant cuts you're probably aware of USAID around the world. But instead of seeing philanthropy step up to support civil society, we've seen a lot of fear and reluctance. A lot of people sort of saying, we'll wait it out. And one of the challenges an organization like mine faces is that we work exclusively on foreign policy. And having grown up in both countries, I've really seen a fundamental difference. I don't want to speak about a particular country, but in my experience, many Americans do not pay attention to foreign policy except the small components that directly affect their lives. We've seen blips of that. Ukraine is probably an example. There are still old Save Darfur signs up around DC that need to be refreshed because it still needs help. There are issues over time that do draw a lot of attention, but in general, the American population does not engage in foreign policy. What that means is that Washington decides foreign policy, not based on constitutional concerns, but based on what people, we say inside the Beltway, so highway, circles DC, what people inside DC think is the right thing to do, or think is the most expedient thing to do, or think they got paid enough to do it. But we don't see a really engaged populace. And what we try to do in part at Freedom Now around the world is support those engaged populaces so that they are demanding of their own government something. On the foreign policy side, we don't see that in the US, and we haven't seen philanthropy stand up to do a lot of that on the foreign policy side. In the US, we've seen a significant support for domestic-focused organizations, and as someone living in the United States, I'm very pleased to see that. But it's as if the blinkers are on. People are not looking outside of the US or outside of North America to see what's happening around the world. And purely for self-interested reasons, it's really important that people do so, because what happens around the world affects those of us here in North America. But beyond the self-interested reasons, what I hope is that we have this sort of moral integrity, this belief that the enjoyment of human rights, and I come at this from a slightly different perspective from a lot of you, I use human rights language, but the enjoyment of human rights, which every person deserves, the individual dignity that we heard about earlier from Brad, that's something that everyone deserves, regardless of where they live. And I have seen less interest in trying to achieve that for people far from home. Those who know me would know that you do not want to ask me for optimism. I'm not the person to end on an optimistic note. But I will say this, I've been doing this for a very long time, and I still do it because I think that I can make a difference. I haven't given up. I haven't just gone off to do something else, because I get up every day and I try to fight for human rights, because I think that it's possible to do that. And for the people we represent, someone sitting in a prison cell, around the world, to hear that people sitting in DC know their name, care about them, have gone to the trouble of filing a petition before the UN to have them declared arbitrarily detained, or to women in Afghanistan who get on a call with my colleagues and just hear that we care. We still care about what they're fighting for, and we'll do what we can to support them, which sometimes is very little. Sometimes it's just, again, letting someone know that you care. But I think that is one of the most important things that we can all do, to think outside of our own small lives and think outside of our own families and communities and borders in the fight for what we all believe.
Okay, well, thank you, Andrea. That's excellent. The good news is now I have 2 phones full of questions. So there's a lot of questions on Slido, and the other good news is that I did give you a little introduction at the beginning, so you know that from your cue card, if you go up to Joanna, Andrea, Patrick afterwards and say you want to chat, you have your cheat notes, your cliff notes. The bad news is we're out of time, and we have to get back on schedule. So I want everyone to give to clap hands and give our applause for our great panelists here.